And good morning, everybody. Happy Tuesday. It is April the 28th. Today we're going to wrap up Unit 6, actually, of the course. And tomorrow we get started on Unit 7, the last unit that could potentially be on the exam. I'm Mr. Horton. I'm from Williamsville South High School, just outside of Buffalo, New York. My partner in crime is Ms. Farr. She's manning the Twitter this morning with there's some questions actually built right into the presentation today, in addition to some ones that I'll throw at you. A couple quick shout outs before we get started. Mr. Gummersall at South Fork High School, Dr. Van Landingham at Cassia Hall Prep in Tulsa, and to my colleagues at the other two Williamsville schools, Mr. Burns at Williamsville North High School and Mr. Nogo over at Williamsville East High School. So shout out to all of you guys and to all the teachers out there working hard from home in these kind of crazy times to get your students ready for this exam coming up. So let's get started. So Unit 6, I'm going to call this Unit 6 Part 2. And really the focus of today is the effects of industrialization. So we're going to look at how industry and the things that Ms. Farr talked about yesterday, how those things are impacting all kinds of different groups of people. And you'll see kind of the connecting thread through a lot of this. So before we do that, though, a quick announcement for teachers and for students. There's a great online resource that we've been asked to share with you, and it's at quill.org/AP. And what this is, it's a free site. Teachers can register on it for free. It's very easy to use. I set it up yesterday for my own students. And there are online tools to help you improve your writing skills. So it's kind of an online practice site. You get immediate feedback, as it says here, working on things like grammar and syntax, etc. So definitely check that out. It's quill.org/AP. Might be a useful resource for prepping for this year's exam and for writing in general. So please make sure you check that out. So our overview today, really, if you look towards at the bottom here, the middle of the slide, we talk about the overriding question is how much really changed in that period, how much stayed the same. So one of my focus points will be continuity and change over time. And at the end of the lesson, you should understand a couple things here. So how the Trans-Mississippi West changed, which is part of our story today, as well as how different groups were impacted by industrialization. And I listed just a few of them there for you. So let's get into what we're going to talk about today. So why did the West grow? There's lots of different reasons why the Trans-Mississippi West grew. Transcontinental Railroad system is completed, and you can see the image that's here on the screen is an image of them completing that transcontinental railroad, where there's a big celebration. They drive the golden spike in, as they say. You can see the workers here are, of course, all celebrating that the work is finally done. This is built with federal government money. It's built with grants of land, which actually turns out to be a lot more valuable even than the money that was given to these companies to build a railroad to connect the East Coast and the West Coast ultimately. Another reason why the West grew is government policy, including the Homestead Act. So the Homestead Act actually gave land away to people, to male head of household. Each male head of household could get up to 160 acres of land for free. All you had to do was file the paperwork for that and promise to go out and improve that land. So basically the government's giving land away, which is unheard of in Europe. Land is the measure of wealth, and of course there's not very much of it. But here in the US, there was lots of land to be given away. So that helps helps the West to grow. The discovery of mineral resources, and when we say that, we mean gold and silver. So think back to the 49ers, who, not the football team, but the miners who discovered gold out in California near Sacramento, which led to this gigantic gold rush of people, not just from America, but literally from around the world, heading off to California to try to strike it rich. You know, it's sort of like their version of the lottery. And people saw economic opportunity and independence in the West, that many people viewed the West as sort of a safety valve, that you could go west and sort of start over again. And there were opportunities in all kinds of different fields that we're going to get into a little bit today. So a little practice. So here's a quick quote for you. What's the author's point of view? And then think about, is this a continuity or is it a change with previous developments? You'll start the timer now. All right, so hopefully you had a chance to think at least a little bit about the point of view here and change or continuity. A couple quick other additional shout outs here. Ms. Prada from North Point, Ms. Kriz from North Quincy in Massachusetts, and a continuing trend here on at Virtual AP US History. Apparently we're feeding students by doing shout outs. Ms. Roldan from Pioneer High School for a free lunch. Her students love our live streams. Thank you all for tuning in. We appreciate that. So what's the author's point of view? Obviously, he's encouraging people to move west. It's 1871, so we're after the Civil War here. And is this a change or continuity with previous developments? Well, if you think about the 1840s, there was a movement in the 1840s, and you can tweet your what the name of that movement was that encouraged people to head out to the west. So what is the name of that idea that encouraged people to move out to the west in the 1840s that would be a continuity with this sentiment that you see here? So you can see the railroad lines. Here is the Transcontinental Railroad, the first one that was completed. This also does a nice job showing you some of the land that was granted to these railroads. So it's a little tough to see. It's not super clear on the screen here. But the sort of darker brown here is the land that was connected to the railroad that was given to the railroad companies to help build the railroads on. So this, of course, is going to be very valuable land eventually because the railroad can now access it. It's sort of an interesting, the land wasn't super valuable till the railroad was built on it. And then, of course, you could hold on to that land and sell it a little bit later on. And you can see that there's other lines eventually that are going to be built. There'll be 5 major trunk lines that extend across the Trans-Mississippi West. So another little practice here, lots of graphics today. So what is the general trend in this chart? And is this a change or a continuity of previous developments? So again, we'll give you 40 seconds on the timer. All right, so hopefully you're noticing in this chart that there is a general upward trend of freight that is eastbound, which means it starts from California and heads to the east. So there's a massive increase of that here in sugar, in fruit, and all eastbound freight is sort of the grayish, light grayish color here. So there's an increase of trade between the west and the east coast, primarily, of course, because of the railroad, or one of the main reasons is the railroad. Is this a change or a continuity? And so on the last slide, we asked about continuity as well, and so that'll be a theme really of the day today. So Manifest Destiny is a continuity with that trend that we saw in this quote. And I think this is also a continuity because trade will increase, that the number of exports from the West, whatever that is, and places that are connected by the railroad is a continuity with how things had existed in the past. Another opportunity in the West is mining, making money from mining things like gold and silver, eventually coal could be part of that as well. And you can see all the different mining towns that grow up here. Some of the great old Western stories like Deadwood and Tombstone are these sort of almost mythological places in the West, these sort of towns that grow up out of nothing and all the crazy wild things that happened there. So so lots of new communities that sort of spring up out of the ground, and if the mines end up taking off, then they sometimes stuck around and sometimes they did not. So other opportunities in the West, ranching. Cowboys would drive cattle from Texas northward towards cattle towns, where they would then be loaded on railroads and sent to the stockyards in places like Cincinnati and Chicago. And eventually the railroad lines were extended down into South Central Texas, which then, of course, you don't need the cowboys anymore to do that. So is this a change or a continuity with previous developments? Something for you to think about, where trade originally starts and grows as a result of the railroad, but then the railroad sort of takes over what was happening for that group of people. And these are, of course, are the cowboys and the classic American icon of that period. And again, you can see the railroads here. I mentioned some of the other transcontinental lines that are built during the period here. You can see some of the mining centers. This map sort of puts a lot of that stuff together. And then, of course, you have the cattle raising regions here in Texas that eventually these trails will be eventually replaced by railroads themselves, ultimately, as I just mentioned. Another opportunity in the West is farmers. So we have lots of things going on at the same time in the West. You have miners, M-I-N-E-R-S, miners. You have cowboys, and then you have farmers. And is my question here at the bottom. Do you notice the sod house? These are people that are living in houses made basically out of mud. There's not very many trees that are out there, not much wood for people to build their houses out of. So Twitter question is, what are the crops, the main crops that were grown on the Great Plains, which is where this image was taken? Photograph of a farm family living out on the Great Plains. And so is this a change or continuity of the previous developments? People moving to the West and farming mainly food products. Well, that's something that had been happening since prior to the Civil War. People moving to, at that time, the West was the Ohio River Valley up to about the Mississippi. So I would argue this is a continuity with that. So you have a family here living in a sod house in the middle of the plains, kind of wide open here, not very many trees. So that answer to that Twitter question, you can see the yellow, lots of corn and wheat through much of the Great Plains here. Definitely wheat up in the more northern part of the Great Plains, and of course cotton down here. Even after the Civil War, that's still an important crop for that region of the West. So corn, wheat, any of those are good answers. Now, of course, we have to remember that there are Native Americans in the West, and this is going to create some conflict, not only between white settlers and Indians, Native Americans, but also between Mexican Americans, people that originally lived in Mexico, that are part of the southwestern part of the United States. So there's lots of conflict that happens. So military and civilian officials encouraged the extermination of buffalo herds to destroy native culture and resistance. And you can see the gentleman here sitting in the photograph on top of a whole pile of buffalo skins. So destroying the buffalo destroyed the way of life of the Great Plains Indians. And what white settlers realized is without the buffalo, the Indians would starve to death and they'd be more at the mercy of white people. So these buffalo skins were sold back in the West and people made a lot of money doing that. So this is an opportunity for, of course, for another group of people, hunters, buffalo hunters, but you also have the destruction of a lifestyle or the reduction of an opportunity for Native Americans in the West. And natives, of course, resisted this. There's lots and lots and lots of examples. There's literally thousands of battles that took place between the US military and different Indian tribes in the West. The US government often violated treaties, as it says here. There are attempts to assimilate natives. So hopefully you remember what assimilate means. That means to make them similar to. And just one example I'll mention just briefly here is the Dawes Act. In the 1880s, this was passed to try to basically convert native peoples into farmers. And the idea was we'll take reservations and break them apart into small blocks of land, 160 acres per family, and that will train those native peoples to be farmers. And eventually we won't have to have reservations anymore. That's kind of the thinking behind the Dawes Act. What the net result of it was is that native peoples ended up losing more land, and what the people that created laws like this kind of forgot is that native people didn't want to become like white people. They wanted to preserve their own cultures. Natives fought back militarily, so the Battle of Little Bighorn is one example. The gentleman that you see here on the slide is General Custer. The Battle of Little Bighorn is also known as Custer's Last Stand, so you can, I think, figure out how that turned out for Custer. Custer and all of his men are wiped out by Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, the leaders of the Sioux Indian nation. So, and again, this is just one example of many, many, many battles that take place between the US military and native peoples. Natives attempted to preserve their culture. There's a thing called the ghost dance movement, which takes place in the West in this period, where this is sort of a mystical belief that all the spirits of all the natives that have ever been killed will come back eventually and help native peoples to reclaim all the lands that were taken by white people. And this was led by shamans of many of the tribes, and became a very important it created a lot of fear among white soldiers that were out in the West, that people were being stirred up by this idea that potentially they could be victorious over the whites. So let's take a look at one of the treaties signed between the U.S. and Native peoples. And again, we'll look for what's the point of view here, and is this a change or continuity with prior developments? All right, so we want to make sure we feed our friends here. Mr. Iwan at Solon High School, Mr. Usselman at Farmington for Ritz Crackers, apparently, and Mrs. D.C. Sar, I think that's how it's pronounced, at Cherry Creek High School. I think that's the Cherry Creek in Western New York. So, and then Ms. Glaffey at East Senior High School in West Seneca, and Ms. Kramer. So a shout out to all those teachers as well. And again, thanks for watching. So the Second Treaty of Fort Laramie, there's lots of things going on here, but basically what you see is an agreement between Native peoples and the white government, the U.S. government, that natives will stick to the land that they're being granted, and they will not essentially trespass or interfere with white settlements there. Is that a change or a continuity? That's an interesting question, where Native people sign treaties that deprive them of land. So hopefully you can think of a couple of examples that are continuities, certainly, with that. And Ms. Farr actually talked about one just the other day with Andrew Jackson. So let's make that a Twitter question. What is what's the name of that policy that Andrew Jackson put into place regarding Native peoples? See if you can come up with that. Another way that whites tried to assimilate Native peoples was through this thing called the Carlisle School in Pennsylvania. And you can see all these young Native children, and they're dressed, of course, like Europeans here. They got their hair cut real short. And the idea, again, was to acculturate them, or to make them like whites. And this is a painting of Custer, the Custer's Last Stand, or the Battle of Little Bighorn, as it was then known. In the map that you see here, these are, again, just a handful of the battles that took place between Native peoples and the U.S. Army. And you can see the looks like little fireballs here, I guess would be what I would call them. And then reservations by 1890, you can see the small chunks of land here that Native peoples were driven onto as a result of a lot of these Indian battles or Indian wars that took place in that period. So that's the first part of what we're going to talk about today, is the West. Part two, response to American industrialization. So how does industry influence other groups of people? So looking at, first of all, at farmers. Farmers, there's a great, maybe a lot of teachers use this. The Wizard of Oz is a great way of sort of teaching some of the things that are going on here. There's a lot of parallels between that story and the late 1800s. So the farmer would be represented, of course, by the scarecrow in that movie, The Wizard of Oz. So farmers had all kinds of problems in this period. It was hard for them to make money because they were overproducing. And this is typically the reaction of farmers in bad economic times, as they end up producing more. And it turns out that actually ends up making things worse for them, not better. So you could make the argument that mechanization, using machines like the mechanical reaper, for example, or the combine, actually makes things worse at the end of the day for farmers, because it makes it easier for them to overproduce. So mechanization, of course, would be part of industrialization here. It's hard for them to borrow money. Railroads were taking advantage of them. Of course, that's how they felt anyway, that railroads, typically there's only one railroad coming through town. You had to use that railroad to ship your products off to market, and farmers felt like they were being taken advantage of there. by railroads and other middlemen, and it was hard for them to purchase manufactured goods like those mechanical products that I mentioned before. The reaper and the combine is just a couple of examples. It was hard for them to get money. It was hard for them to purchase these things because they cost a lot of money. And then the gold standard. So let's run through that kind of quickly. So people that believed in the gold standard were people that were creditors, people that did not want to see the value of money itself change. So in the late 1800s, the federal government actually made money out of metal. So they coined money. So people that were in favor of only gold being used for coins wanted to limit the amount of money in circulation. So the less there is of something, the more valuable it is essentially what the story is here. The Silverites were people like farmers, debtors, people that owed money, that wanted the government to coin money in both gold and silver, because in their view, that would have made a lot more money available, even though the money would have been essentially worth less. So farmers began to see the coinage of money in silver, which meant silver and gold, that both those metals would be used, would increase the money supply, and they thought that this would be the magic solution to all of their problems. So in the Wizard of Oz story, the original, the book, the magical slippers that Dorothy wears through much of the story were actually silver and not ruby, as they were turned into in the movie. So the idea here, of course, is that silver would be the magic or silver bullet, I guess, that would solve all of their problems, this currency problem. So let's try another document here. Again, trying to stick to some primary source things. So congrats to Liliana Gordon for getting that Indian Removal Act first on Twitter. So we'll start the timer here. Take a second to read through this. All right, so this is a person that's making the argument that the railroad is really the thing that now is the new pioneer, if you want to sort of summarize this document. The railroad is the pioneer the individual follows, where in the old days it would be people like Daniel Boone, for example, the pioneer that first supposedly crosses the Appalachian Mountains into Kentucky. Um, so what are some of the things that farmers did? And they formed their own organizations. They basically began to organize themselves through things like the Grange and Farmers Alliances. But most notably in this period, they eventually formed their own political party. And it's called the Populist Party. It's mainly farmers. It also includes some people that are industrial workers. But notice some of the things that they wanted to accomplish here. These were parts of their platform. The free coinage of silver. There's that silver gold issue that I just talked about a few minutes ago. A graduated income tax, which of course would tax the wealthy more than the poor. Reclaiming lands held illegally by railroads, and of course this is their term for that. They believe the railroads should give back that land that was given to them by the government, because government really represents all of us. Where they get a little bit more radical here is that they believe ultimately the government should own the railroad, should own the telephone, should own the telegraph. So lots of interesting ideas here. What's neat about, and then secret ballot, direct election of senators, are some political changes that they want. Some of the things that working class people in the cities were fighting for, with things like the 8-hour day. What's interesting about a lot of these ideas, the Populist Party never wins the presidency, even though they run in a couple of elections here in the late 1800s. But a lot of their ideas ultimately are going to be put into operation by the group that comes in the next. We'll actually cover them tomorrow, the Progressives. So maybe the most famous of the populists was William Jennings Bryan, who gave a very, very famous speech called the Cross of Gold. You shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold. And of course, he's evoking Christian imagery here to try to make people understand that the gold standard is asking everybody else to basically sacrifice for those folks that are in favor of the gold standard. So let's see. Yeah, let's take a minute to read through this. So what's the purpose? Is this a continuity or a change with previous developments? All right. So the purpose of a party platform is to announce here is what the party stands for. And we'll be seeing these being developed over the course of the summer between the Democrats and the Republicans as we head towards the 2020 election. So congrats to Liliana Gordon for getting my last question right. First, Mr. Browning at TC Roberson High School, shout out to you. And a student named Grace, thank you very much for this. It's very sweet. Wants to shout Ms. Farr and I out for doing the live streams, and you're more than welcome for that. So thank you for tuning in. Appreciate that. So is this a change or continuity with previous developments? This is a person or a document that is arguing that the average citizen ought to retake power for themselves. That, as it says here, if we're given power, we'll labor to correct the evils by wise and reasonable laws, etc., returning the government of the republic to the hands of the plain people. So who was the president that we could make a connection here to the past? Who's the continuity between this document and an earlier president that would have agreed with this idea of restoring the government to the average person, or the common man would have been the person that the way that he would have referred to it, and that would be the continuity. So what's the name of that president? We can send that out as a Twitter question. So this is a political cartoon, lots of great political cartoons from that period, talking about the Democratic Party being taken over by the agrarian left, that the populists, these sort of more drastic folks that were looking for more drastic change, had taken over control of the Democratic Party. And if we wanted to change or update this cartoon to 2020, when I put this together, actually, he was still in the race, but you could change the name here to Bernie Sanders, right? And take the word agrarian out of that, assuming that Sanders had won the nomination in 2020 for the Democrats, which of course he hadn't, but very similar idea, kind of making the connection here as well. So so for my last question, we asked about, who was the hero of the common man, who would have been very in sympathy with this populist party, and that, of course, would be Andrew Jackson, who Ms. Farr talked about just the other day. So let's take a look at this one. This is a great cartoon for the populist party. So what's the cartoonist's point of view of this? We'll start the timer. All right, so hopefully you're recognizing the People's Party or the Populist Party is the title here, but the name of the cartoon is A Party of Patches. So they're patching together all these groups that are, a lot of them are kind of on the more radical extreme of American politics, the Free Soil thing, the Socialist Party, of course, Knights of Labor, who we'll talk about in just a little bit. The farmers' alliances, etc., and they refer to this as a platform of lunacy. So this person is suggesting, or this cartoonist is suggesting, that the Populist Party are a collection of these sort of crazy ideas that are trying to win power, and of course they're throwing out these things to try to get people to support them: free coinage and government control of railroads, etc. This is kind of a classic cartoon about the Populist Party, and of course these are all people that are making the argument that government should be more involved. At least most of them are. The anarchists certainly aren't arguing that, but so I would say that this is is this a change or continuity? That's a good question for you to kind of think about. By the way, some of you made the connection between Jefferson and that Populist Party thing, and that also would be a good answer for that question. I made it general enough that you could do that. Another group that's influenced by industry or impacted by industry are immigrants, or what we would today call international migrants. And so there's, hopefully I'm sure your teachers have talked about push and pull factors. Pull factors are things that are attracting people to their new place that they're going to settle, like freedom and economic opportunity. Push factors are the factors that are encouraging people to leave wherever it was that they originally lived. And again, some examples here. There's sort of two sides of the same coin. But immigrants, of course, are going to be influenced by the Industrial Revolution as well, or by industry, because there's going to be economic opportunity in those industries. And a lot of people are going to flee, especially Europe, to come to America to try to find new economic opportunity here. So you can see in the chart, this really does a nice job of showing who these new immigrants are, this new group of immigrants who are, if you look at the chart here, mainly from Central and Eastern and Southern Europe, not from Western Europe, not from Northern Europe, and especially 1885. I mean, wow, look at this huge number of immigrants coming in that year. And then 10 years later, of course, it's still this very large number of people coming from those regions. They're coming from regions that traditionally had not sent large numbers of people to the US. 70% of immigrants came through New York City, also referred to sometimes as the Golden Door. Baltimore was the second largest point of entry for immigrants on the East Coast. And of course, there also are immigrants coming in on the West Coast, and we'll talk about them in just a second. These folks mainly settled in cities in the Northeast, places like New York and Philadelphia and Boston and Baltimore, because this is where jobs were. This is where opportunities were for those folks. They lived in ethnic communities, or also known as ghettos. Makes sense. You probably want to settle with people that are similar to you, speak the same language as you, and that might be friends from the old country or family members that you know. From there, they took low-paying menial jobs. These are people, a lot of them tended to be very poor. So they were willing to take whatever jobs were available to them in the cities, in factories, at the docks, those kinds of jobs. And the religion are mainly non-Protestant. So we have larger numbers of Jewish immigrants, you have larger numbers of Catholic immigrants, you have larger numbers of Eastern Orthodox immigrants coming into the US. So they're not Protestant, which is the main religion of the United States at this point. So let's send a quick Twitter question out there. What was the name of the political party in the 1850s that was opposed to immigrants? For a large part of the reason for that is that they were Catholic. So what was the name of that political party from the 1850s that was opposed to immigrants? Yeah, we'll do that there. So Steerage Class, these are some images. On the left side, you have immigrants coming from Europe to the United States. Steerage was the lowest class of to make your way over, is the cheapest ticket to make your way across the ocean. But the image that you see here are Chinese immigrants coming to the United States, coming to the West Coast. And they also sat in Steerage Class. You can see that they're crowded together here. Lots of people are making their way across the ocean, whether it's the Pacific or the Atlantic Ocean. Ellis Island is the very famous immigrant processing station that's established in New York City in the late 1800s. Angel Island was actually the processing center for immigrants on the West Coast, which was also established around the same time period here. Okay. And many of these folks ended up living, at least the European immigrants ended up living in tenements like this. So again, another quick Twitter question here for you. What other groups, also began moving to the cities of the North in the 1910s for economic opportunities? So you can zip out an answer for that to @virtualapush. So what's the other group of people that begin moving to the cities starting around the middle part of the 19-teens when World War I begins? So you can see folks living here, very crowded together here, very cramped quarters. Living in the cities here in the tenements in New York City. There's actually a museum, tenement museum in the lower part of Manhattan, if you ever get a chance to travel there, where you can actually take tours to recreate the it's almost like you're walking through time as you meet different families that are actors that are pretending to be families that were alive in those days. So let's do this one. What's this author's point of view about immigrant labor? So we see here a person that's the point of view is a person that is suggesting that laborers, especially in this case, they're referring to Italian laborers, are being taken advantage of, and that laws, which are supposed to try to help that person, are actually helping the contractor or the boss, the person that is hiring these folks to do that. So this is a point of view of sort of being in sympathy with those laborers who are being taken advantage of in this time period that we're talking about. So. Okay, so Dumbell Tenements, this is just a diagram of what the tenement buildings look like. You can see if we're looking at this from a bird's eye view that they're sort of shaped like a dumbbell. And so you'd have 4 apartments on a floor, and the WC here is a nickname for water closet, the bathroom, which would be shared among different families, and you have to share the public space and all that. Not very fun way of making a living. We talked about ethnic communities, just to use New York City again as an example. Little Italy, if you've ever traveled there, or Chinatown are just 2 of the more famous examples. This is a more recent image that shows all the different ethnic groups that are living in different neighborhoods in New York City. So you have Manhattan Island, for example, here in Long Island, the tip of Long Island anyway there. So still very similar to that. Reactions to new immigrants, much like the reaction of groups like Kirsten Bennis got this first. African Americans were the group that were moving to the cities from the South in what was called the Great Migration. We'll get to that in a little bit. And so similar to the American Party, the Know Nothing Party that was anti-immigrant, there are some folks that were anti-immigrant. Groups like the Immigration Restriction League, which is formed in 1894. But then there are other folks that believe in the message of the Statue of Liberty, right? The very famous poem, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free," that we should welcome immigrants into the U.S. So this is not a new debate, the debate that we have today about immigration and the border wall. This is an old debate. And there was a debate about the old immigrants. Folks didn't like them because they were Irish and they were Catholic, and they didn't really fit with what people saw as, mainstream American society at the time. The same story is going to happen here. We have a different group of immigrants coming in now, but similar responses. So, and another way that people responded is by taking advantage of them. Political bosses manipulated immigrants. They would help them find homes. They would help them find jobs. And then, of course, the payback was when the time came for an election, we would knock on the door and remind these folks of who helped them to get those jobs. So here's a quick question for Twitter. What's the name of the most famous political boss in New York City history who very much took advantage of the poor, the urban poor and immigrants in his district? What was the name of that guy? You might have seen him in a few cartoons from Thomas Nast, another hint there for you. And in another way that Americans responded to immigrants is to try to help them. So the image that you see here is Jane Addams, a very famous woman that started Hull House in Chicago. The idea of settlement houses was to help immigrants to make the transition to American society. They would provide things like childcare services. They would provide education and learning how to speak the language and the English language to help immigrants to make that transition into the United States. So lots of different responses here. Do we welcome immigrants? Do we stop them from coming in? Do we take advantage of them? Apparently, Ms. Farr already posted my question, so we must be using the same brain this morning. So what is this cartoonist point of view about immigration? Let's do this one. We'll start the timer now. Some really good symbolism in this one. So you'll notice that the chute that these folks are coming out of is labeled direct from the slums of Europe daily. And maybe you notice that the immigrants are being portrayed here as rats. So that should give you some sense of how this cartoonist feels about them, certainly, or at least how they're portraying them here, that they're the mafia, that they're anarchists, that they're socialists, that they're murderers. And notice what Uncle Sam is doing. He seems to be standing there allowing this to happen. And in the smoke of the cigar that Uncle Sam is smoking there is the image of a president, and that is President William McKinley, who was assassinated by an anarchist immigrant. So I think the cartoonist is trying to remind us that some of these folks that come over don't always do things that we should be really thrilled about, and that maybe we should be doing something more to stop immigrants from coming in. So I would argue that, I would say this is an anti-immigration cartoon for sure. Lots of good symbolism there. Let's try another one. Maybe you've seen this one. Looking backward here, you can see there's an immigrant being stopped by these wealthy looking gentlemen, but behind the gentlemen are these shadows. And the shadows, of course, are supposed to represent what those gentlemen look like when they first immigrated to the United States. So I think this cartoonist is pointing out the irony of Americans being opposed to immigration who were either immigrants themselves or the children of immigrants somewhere in their back in the shadow here, as we'll see. All right, another group that's affected by the Industrial Revolution or by industry itself are workers in those industries. And so you can see in the chart that agriculture shrinks, so less and less people are farmers. As time goes along here. So more and more people are moving to cities, and more people are taking jobs in those factories. So just a couple of points to be made here. Mass production leads to lower prices. That's good for people that are looking to purchase products. So the standard of living for many people increased. The price of goods goes down. That's a positive thing for many consumers. But the gap between the rich and the poor continues to widen. So the rich become very, very rich, and the poor, the gap between those very, very rich people and the very poor people continues to get even wider and wider and wider. Workers eventually organized unions. I'll talk about some of those in just a second. Then the workforce expanded due to immigration, not only immigration from Europe and from China, as I mentioned, until the Chinese Exclusion Act is passed, but also immigration from the farms of America to the cities, and immigration eventually from the South with the Great Migration, which we talked, asked a Twitter question about just a little bit ago. And child labor increases as well. And Ms. Farr talked about this a little bit yesterday with that image of the little girl in the factory, and why company owners might use little girls in those, or little children in those factory situations. So again, a quick little chart here that shows you the drop in prices of things like food and fuel and lighting. And you can see the cost of living index. So what that means is that the price of these goods is actually attainable for most people based on the chart that you see here. So just remember, this is, industrialization is kind of a switch from the guy that you see on the left here to the image that you see on the right. And think about the difference between those two workplaces, working in a factory on the right versus working in a shop like you see the guy doing on the left-hand side here. So the guy on the left, he decides when he's going to start work and when he's going to stop work. He decides how much he's going to charge for his labor. And he's a craftsman. He's a person that has a lot of skill in order to be able to build a rifle basically from nothing, or whatever the product might be. The folks on the right-hand side, of course, they have to just be good at their job. The guy that's working this planing machine here doesn't have to know all the steps of making a gun. He just needs to know how to do his little part of that. And he doesn't get to decide when he's going to start work and when he's going to stop work, because everybody has to be there working at the same time for industry to actually work. So let's try this document. Take a minute to read through this. Congrats to Michael Raybetz, who got my last question correct. The question about African Americans, I believe it was the last question that we asked. And then shout out to Mr. Baumholt out there from your students as well. So what's the point of view of this? This person is talking about the impact of industry on the worker, and that they're losing independence, and that they're in a measure helpless, as he calls them. They don't have pride in their work anymore because they're not the one that's really creating that. So, so this person is actually describing what we would call de-skilling of American labor, that workers no longer had to have the ability to do all the different parts of things here. And this person, just looking at some of the vocabulary that this person is using, they're not really, it doesn't sound like they're very thrilled about that. They're pointing out the negative elements of that. This used to be a special characteristic of American workmen that seems to have been lost in the process of all this. And think about, is this a continuity with earlier developments like the market revolution? So one of the ways that workers responded to this is that they formed labor unions. And so the Knights of Labor is one of the groups early on. The easy way I always tell my students to remember the word broad. They had broad goals and they had broad membership. They believed that everybody that was a laborer should be unified together, with the exception of bar owners and lawyers, and I think there was one other group that I'm forgetting off the top of my head here, but everybody else should all belong to one big union, and that big union would be able to accomplish all kinds of things like currency reform and creating cooperatives for workers, kind of like mini socialist utopias almost. And so very, very, very broad goals, very, very broad membership, and arguably this is the reason why they ultimately were unsuccessful, is that they tried to unionize too many people at the same time. So they eventually are going to collapse after something called the Haymarket Square incident, where they're blamed for the violence that breaks out there. Yeah, let's take a minute to try this one. So a hint here, if you knew that Samuel Gompers was the head of the American Federation of Labor, which I'm going to talk about in just a second, you'd probably know that this is a very pro-worker perspective that he's giving us here. And what's his point of view? His point of view is that we should reduce the number of hours, that people should not be treated like property, that we should have better wages, I mean, all these sort of typical things. And it makes sense if you look at where, we look at the audience for a second. He's giving this address at the International Labor Congress in Chicago. He's firing people up and saying, here's what we demand, here's what we really want. So the AFL, I always tell my students, remember the word narrow with this group. So they had a narrow membership. Only skilled workers could be in this union. And they're actually a federation of skilled unions themselves, craft unions, as they sometimes are referred to. And their goals were narrow. And the last document that we took a look at really sort of describes those goals. They're very, very narrow. They're focused around what they eventually called bread and butter unionism. What are the things that a working man's union can fix? They can fix the number of hours that they work. They can fix the wages. They can fix the conditions. Those are the things that impact workers directly, and those are the things that we should be worried about, not creating a cooperative or doing currency reform or all those other kinds of things. So the AFL replaces essentially the Knights, who collapse around the same time that this is arising. So that's the AFL, as it's sometimes referred to. Again, another labor union organization. Other workers joined the Socialist Party, and the Socialist Party was what President Theodore Roosevelt would eventually refer to as the lunatic fringe, the sort of really out there kind of radical folks. But again, what socialists are looking for here is government intervention in the economy to do something to help the working class people, which is essentially what the quote is talking about here. Eugene V. Debs is the most famous of the socialists. He runs for president 4 different times. He actually runs for president once when he was in jail for being part of a labor strike. So sort of an interesting character also in early American history. So strikes is one way that these labor unions fought back against the companies, excuse me. So, and you can see some of the famous ones are here: the Great Railroad Strike, which hits in 1877, and the Homestead Strike, which happens in 1892. The Haymarket Square incident, which leads to the death of the Knights of Labor, as we mentioned just a little bit before. And so this is a knockdown, drag-out fight between the workers of these industries, especially the railroad industry. You can see the steel industry as a big part of this whole thing, and their bosses. And a lot of people die. A lot of property is destroyed in the process of this. It's kind of ugly in that period. So the Homestead Strike, this is just one example of many from that period, where the Pinkertons were brought in to protect the factory or to take over the factory from the workers, and there's violence that breaks out, and this is kind of a typical story. And often what happens is the government steps in to try to put an end to the bloodletting, and they typically take the side of the bosses in this in these cases. So so workers are really fighting an uphill battle is kind of the point of what's going on here for them. They're fighting tooth and nail for better working conditions, for wages, either to get better wages or to stop wage cuts is another example. And you also have this very famous labor organizer named Mother Jones, who fought against child labor, including the girl that we saw yesterday in the video, and breaker boys working in the mines. So you get some of these images that similar to what we saw yesterday with Ms. Farr, the fact that these folks, little kids working in factories. You see the little kid here with no shoes on, and he's standing on the basket down here to collect whatever it is that they're making. Breaker boys working in the coal mines. You can see the dirty faces here of these little kids, unfortunately. So last group to kind of wrap up today is writers. Twitter question: who have advocated a radical solution to the problems of capitalism in their book Capital in Europe? So let's see if you remember this from either Global or AP World, whatever you studied before. So there's different ideas that begin floating around here. So some people advocated theories to justify why capitalism is the way it is, and some people advocated helping the poor, and others questioned some of those ideas, especially the assumption of laissez-faire capitalism. So let's talk about a couple of quick examples. So Herbert Spencer is one for sure. Make sure you know him. Social Darwinism is his big idea. And the idea here is we're going to take the theory of Darwin and we're going to apply it to people. So in Darwinism, the weakest and the least well-adapted organisms die off. So what Spencer is essentially arguing here is that folks that are not well-adapted, the people that are starving and poor and don't have skills and can't find jobs, we really shouldn't be helping them very much, because that's Darwinism in practice. That in our society, we're sort of weeding out the elements that aren't doing a very good job at adapting to the new version of the game here. It's a pretty, I know when I always present this to my students when we talk about this, it's a pretty cold-hearted thing when you think about it. It's sort of, well, some people are going to die, so well, we'll just kind of let that happen. But it's used to justify these folks that are very, very rich, because the thinking here is that, well, they're the best adapted, and they're the ones that, of course, deserve to be where they are. So it's Darwinism applied to human beings is kind of the idea of this. Similarly, Horatio Alger, a very famous writer from this period, who writes these books that are referred to as dime novels. They typically were marketed to young people, teenagers, kids just a little bit younger than you. And the basic moral of the story each time here was that, working hard and being honest would get you ahead in life. And they're the classic old rags to riches stories. So Ragged Dick is one of the more famous ones. It's the one I read when I was in college, and it's a classic story. It's this young boy who's living on the streets of New York, and he makes money by shining people's shoes, and he's honest and hardworking, and he stops his friends from stealing at one point, and eventually a wealthy man realizes his potential and helps him to go to school, and eventually he becomes very, very, very successful. So the long story short here is work hard, get ahead. But again, you'll notice Spencer is arguing We don't need government to get involved. No one should get involved in the economy. And Alger's arguing the same thing. This is very similar to, or not different, I guess I would say, from laissez-faire. Government should not get involved here. It's hard work and good luck and honesty. Those are the things that will get you ahead. We don't need government to get involved. So let's try this one, read through this document. What is this author, what is his point of view? All right, so we have, this is Carnegie, who is one of the wealthiest people that ever lived. And what is he suggesting here? That rich people have a responsibility, right, to help people. So wealthy individuals as opposed to the government should help the poor. So he still believes that in laissez-faire, that government should not be involved, but the quote that you just read here is called the gospel of wealth, or referred to as the gospel of wealth. So the idea here is that the wealthy have a responsibility to help people. And what he's not suggesting here is giving out money to people. He's suggesting providing opportunity to folks, like building libraries and universities and that kind of thing. So, so this is, again, a different attitude or philosophy towards wealth. Henry George is probably the more radical of the folks that we're talking about here. He believes that government should tax land or wealth and use that money to redistribute it to people that are on the bottom of things. So he is advocating a non-laissez-faire attitude towards all of this kind of thing. And you're going to see more and more of these things. We'll talk about these more in detail tomorrow. And the last one is Washington Gladden, who is a Christian who basically makes the argument that it's called the social gospel, that Christian people should be responding to the ills of industrialization by not standing back, but by doing something about it. So we should be helping people, is kind of what he's suggesting here, that a good Christian person would not stand back and allow people to starve to death or to suffer in these terrible conditions. So he, similar to Henry George, is beginning to suggest that maybe government does have a role here that we need to take care of. So debriefing, kind of putting this all together here for you. So the railroad connects all this together, both literally and figuratively. The West, the railroad, of course, with farmers and the cowboys that we talked about early on. Industry, unions, many of these unions are fighting strikes against these railroad companies. Immigration, which is going to benefit from the railroad. Urbanization, farmers, I mean, literally the railroad sort of connects all the stories together here. Industry impacts different groups in different ways, and I spent some time talking about a whole bunch of different groups here today: the farmers and industrial workers who form unions, and immigrants coming into the United States, and migrants in the US heading to those cities for opportunities. The middle class, who's going to grow as a result of this eventually, etc. I mean, there's lots of different groups that are being impacted in a whole bunch of different ways. And people began to debate the role of government during this period. And that really leads us into tomorrow's lesson, which is to talk about how that role of government is going to change. So I'll leave you with this. This is, if we were looking at a question that that was asking about continuity and change in the time period. Here's a whole bunch of different groups that you could make the point. Here are some of the continuities between this time period and earlier time periods. And here are some of the changes between this time period and earlier time period. So how is it different? How is it similar? So kind of almost, if you had an essay like this, it would almost be a cheat sheet for all of those kinds of things. So I'll leave that on the screen as we kind of count down today. It's just about noon, and I apologize that we ran a little long here, but lots and lots of topics to cover in this time period. So thanks again for tuning in. We will hopefully see you tomorrow. I'll be back doing progressivism and imperialism. So have a great day. Thanks again for tuning in. Bye-bye.